Welcome to the Gospel Addict Podcast. I'm Greg Bryan.
And I'm Jim Reske.
We're gospel addicts because we believe the gospel of Jesus isn't just good news, it's the best news ever.
We're addicted to the gospel because it doesn't just start us out in the Christian life, it is the Christian life.
Join us as we look at the Bible through the lens of the gospel.
Thanks so much for listening.
Welcome back to another episode of the Gospel Addict Podcast. I'm here with my friend Jim Reske. I'm Greg Bryan, and tonight we are going to be talking about Romans chapter 3, 4, and 5. We'll see how far we get, but I know, Jim, you're going to be teaching these chapters at this men's Bible study that we both teach at. How's your preparation going? What are you seeing so far?
Well, thanks, Greg. Thanks for asking. Great to be with you. And thanks to all our listeners for tuning into the podcast. It's going okay. I think that whenever I do these things, so first of all, I'm not in full-time Christian ministry. Most of the people that speak at this Bible study are not. And if this is your first podcast you listen to, what we're talking about is speaking to a group of about 50 people in a room. It's not and people can just ask questions anytime. And it's that kind of Bible study. It's not a sitting around a table and talking. It's guys sitting around a table and listening, and then contributing as they feel led to do so. But when you do this, you almost feel like you just never ever can prepare enough. Like I want to read one more commentary, and I want to read one more, listen to one more, sermon about it. And I want to. So I still have a stack of commentaries. I've started going through a bunch of things. I spent a lot of time on it. I've got a basic outline together, but there's always more. And I guess you could no one's supposed to ever have all the answers. So you feel like if someone asks a question, well, how does this verse tie into that thing? You wish you had, I studied this and I knew the answer to be the answer man. But it's okay if you don't. There's only so much. And usually there's someone else in the audience eager to answer that question too. So.
And we should say that this Bible study, one of the cool things about the Bible study is we teach through the whole Bible in a 2-year period. So we cover usually large chunks of scripture, sometimes the whole books. Like in a couple of weeks, I'll be teaching the whole book of Colossians. But you are covering
Romans
three chapters. So easy peasy, right, Jim?
Yeah, easy peasy, except Romans is so dense. There's so much to it. I did get a lot of benefit out of a Keller sermon. He has a sermon on Romans 3 and a sermon on Romans 5. The Romans 3 is called it's like Justified by Faith. And then I forget the title of Romans 5 one. That's more about suffering. Nothing on Romans 4, but he wrote a book also on Romans 1 through 7, Romans 1 through 7 for you. That's been a helpful commentary. I got a couple of commentaries I'm using too. So starting to get some ideas and thoughts and starting to come together, but there's a week to go. Always wish you'd have more time.
Right. So what's your outline looking like at this point?
So here's the thing. I'm going to try to pick up where you left off. And I think that, you set the stage in Romans 1 and 2, but I'm going to kind of, re-summarize that a little bit. So Romans 1 basically says all the irreligious of the world are sinners. And then Romans 2 comes by and says all the religious people of the world, you know different, you know better. You are complete sinners as well. So here, I'll just give you the whole flyover overview of the whole thing, and then we'll come back and talk about detail. Then Romans 3, basically, the first half of that talks about how all have sinned. Basically summarizes Romans 1 and 2. Yes, the religious have sinned, the irreligious have sinned, all have sinned. And then right in the middle of Romans 3, it breaks and it says, but now the response to that is we have justification through faith in Jesus Christ. So, but it gets, Romans 1 and 2 are very dark, like we talked about in the after talk to your talk. And it gets darker and darker and darker all the way through about halfway through Romans 3. And then then you get the solution that comes by. And let's circle back and talk about that some more. Romans 4, Paul talks about Abraham and David. He has to deal with the idea of like, well, if salvation isn't just because of being Jewish, what about Abraham? And so Paul deals with that in Romans 4, basically by arguing that Abraham and David were both saved by grace. Mm-hmm. And then Romans 5 is split in two halves. The first half is the benefits of our justification, and the second half is all about the second Adam, really answering how do we know that this is really true. So I'll be spending probably when I do this most of the time in Romans 3. Romans 4, almost not at all. I'll put one page up. Here's an outline. Here's what it says. Not going to read a passage from it. Just I'm not going to cover Romans 4. And then I'll try to cover the first half of Romans 5, but that's the basic idea.
Yeah, that's great. Um, so what in Romans chapter 3 are you learning? What's standing out to you?
Yeah, I'll give you the highlights and a couple things I really want to get to and talk about in Romans 3. So I'm kind of eager to get to it, and I'll make sure that no matter what happens with time and time management in the study, that we get some of these things out. Because Romans 3 starts with a dialogue, because by the end of Romans 2, Paul has really created quite a problem for himself. He's basically said, to a Jewish audience, at least a partly Jewish audience, a mixed Gentile Jewish audience, he said that irreligious people are completely lost and sinners, but the religious people are no better at all. And at the end, even at the end of Romans 2, he talks about how, well, it's not really one who is a Jewish by blood. It's Jewish is more of a matter, being Jewish is more of a matter of the heart, or some language to that effect. So he really would have had people's heads spinning. And he just creates this dilemma for himself because the Jewish audience would have said, wait a second, hold the phone. For 2,000 years, we've been told we were God's chosen people.
Right.
I Isn't that the way it works? Doesn't that count? Isn't that supposed to be some kind of, doesn't that mean
Shouldn't there be
anything?
some
What is it?
advantage?
So exactly, it's like that's exactly. Should there be some advantage in being God's chosen people? I mean, it's
Like
just like
chapter 3, verse 1, he's like, what advantage then is there in being a Jew?
right.
What value is there in circumcision? And how does Paul answer that?
So he says great in every respect, and then right then he says, first of all, they were entrusted with the oracles of God. But the first of all tells you that it's start of a laundry list, but he doesn't pick up the rest of the laundry list until chapter 9. In chapter
Oh,
9, he talks
wow.
about it's in 9, he'll pick up and say, there's great advantage to any, and the scholars who wrote about this that I was reading about said that Paul maintained at the end that there were great advantages in being Jewish. And so there was really, um, he talks about in the chapter 9, someone else will talk about in a couple of weeks, but the adoption as sons, the divine glory, the covenants, the receiving of the law, the temple worship, and the promises, all benefits of being Jewish, right? He says, so he's not disregarding any of that. So it's just the first of the laundry list. But this first bit says they were entrusted with the oracles of God. And the part of the point of this, and Paul does this, he realizes that someone's going to object right away. That's why he does it in this style called
Yeah.
a diatribe, which is like an imaginary conversation with an objector. Someone will say this, well, but then and Paul argues with someone in his writing
He's
for these
arguing
first
as
verses.
yeah, his writing is like the argument.
Right. Exactly. It's like the argument. So he's saying, are you saying there's no advantage of being Jew? No, I'm not. I'm not saying that. There really are advantages. They have a special position, but the point he's trying to make is that that position was one of responsibility, not privilege. So I'm going to pull up, my wife actually gave this to me, Isaiah 43, verse 10, which God said, he said, I want you to be my witnesses. So he says, yes, you're my chosen people. I called you out to be separate so that other people would see what it's like, so that you could be that witness to the nations, right? And people, what it's like to live with God. They'd read the whole history of the Old Testament. They didn't do that. And
Yeah, so you're responsible. So and we have this as believers too, right? We're
yeah,
responsible. We may be the only Bible somebody reads. We may be the only
yeah,
believer a person has contact with.
right,
And so
right.
that's a great responsibility.
Yeah, and certainly we have more of the Word of God than they did as well, right? So we have the whole canon, right? So there's a great responsibility with that. But that's the point. They're looking at it as a kind of a privilege, and Paul saying it was really more of a responsibility than it was a privilege. Um, anyway, so that's the first part of that, as he's trying to wrestle and resolve that dilemma that he created for himself at the end of chapter 2. Um, but then in chapter 3, verse 5, he starts talking about the righteousness of God. Introduces that concept, and he says, but if our unrighteousness demonstrates the righteousness of God, what shall we say? And you did this last week. You talked about like Luther, who said, Luther before his conversion looked at the term the righteousness of God and thought of this is this unattainable standard. And so it felt crushing to him, right? He felt like,
Yeah.
that, and I don't remember if you did you say this last week, that quote that Luther said that love God, sometimes I hate him. Did you
Yeah.
mention that?
Yeah, I
Yeah.
did.
Okay. Because yeah, he's felt like,
Yeah,
this,
he began to hate God because it was like he was trying so hard to be as good a person as he could be without sin. He was trying
right.
not to sin, and he just failed over and over again. And he started to hate God because he's like, he just thought it was, he was miserable.
Yeah. And so the righteousness of God, that concept is like way higher than people think it is, right? So, but in this passage, what Paul's saying is our unrighteousness demonstrates the righteousness of God. So he's talking about the contrast. And what I noticed here, and let me bounce this off you, Greg, because I didn't get this from a commentary. I was just doing this, meditating on the verse. He doesn't say the awful sin of the irreligious in chapter 1 demonstrates the righteousness of God. Think of the contrast, right? Of the depth of their sinfulness, these irreligious, awful people, these immoral people, and the righteousness of God. What a contrast. He didn't talk about the sin of those sinners. He says our unrighteousness. So now he's talking about the people more like the religious people in chapter 2. She's talking about not our sin, our unrighteousness. So in
Right.
other words, these are people who are trying to be good, trying to be moral, trying to be good. He says, what you have, by contrast to God's holy mountain of righteousness, is unrighteousness. And he doesn't use the word sin. He uses unrighteousness, like the negative righteousness. I'm not sure that concept is fully baked or hangs together, but I was just noticing the difference in that he's contrasting not the sin of the immoral people in chapter 1. It's the unrighteousness of the people who are trying to be righteous. In other words, what he's saying is all our righteousness, all our good deeds that we're trying to do is all filthy rags.
Right.
In comparison to God's righteousness, it's filthy rags.
Right. And
It's
that's a verse.
Yes,
Yeah. Our righteous deeds are filthy rags in God's sight.
I think it's Isaiah 64. I should look that up.
It's
But all righteousness is filthy rags.
yeah.
Anyway, so Keller's definition of righteousness, that kind of sets up the one of the things I want to say later, later in the chapter. I thought he did. This is a really great phrase, and I'll give him credit for it. But he said righteousness. He said we're all basically trying to develop our own righteousness, no matter if you're religious or irreligious, or even as a believing Christian. Right. The definition he uses for righteousness is a validating performance record that opens doors. A validating performance record that opens doors. So you think of your resume. This is my righteousness. Look, this is my record, my validating performance record. If you're trying to get into college, like this is my high school transcript, right?
Mm,
This is my performance record. I got these test scores. I got these grades. Please open the door. This is my validating performance record. And the point, and this is what I'm going to try to do, Greg. Um, we talked in our last podcast about speaking to non-Christians versus a Christian audience. I think that even as I think about how to work this in, but even as believers, we still do this.
oh, for
So
sure.
right,
For
so
sure.
you're a Christian, right? You
Right.
know you're saved by grace. And if I go to the group of Christians, they say salvation's by grace through faith, especially a group of Protestants. They're going to say, yeah, right, yeah, we know this. Okay, but you know what? I'm still building a validating performance record to open doors. I still feel this need to validate and justify my life. And the
Yeah.
quotes Keller uses that quote from Chariots of Fire that everyone uses. The one guy who's a runner in the Olympics, and he says, "When that gun goes off, I've got 10 seconds to validate my existence." It's a
Yeah.
perfect quote for this thought.
Right.
I was thinking I'm going to try to use Paul Simon's song "Slip Sliding Away."
Oh yeah.
Remember that?
Yeah.
There's a verse where he says, "And I know a father who had a son, and he longed to tell him all the reasons for the things he'd done. He came a long way just to explain, kissed his boy as he lay sleeping, and then he turned around and headed home again."
Huh.
And that it captures this great thought, this feeling you have, like saying, I want to explain my life. I'm here because I made these decisions, but I had reasons for those decisions. And you should know, you should understand. And I just feel like even as a believer, as a Christian, we're still
Oh, for sure.
Carrying this burden to create this.
And that's so important. And that's why this message is so yeah, believers need to hear this.
Yeah. So
It's
I think
so
so.
easy, and this is what Paul, the brilliance of Paul in the book of Romans is like chapter one, he's like, even with the thought you're sharing, we can think of people, right, that aren't believers, and we can
Right.
say, oh yeah, man, they're doing that. They're doing
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
But then we need to look at ourselves and say, how am I doing that?
How am I doing that? Right. So yes, recently said I don't want to get nothing political, but I saw some banners people have hanging outside their house saying, I believe in this. This is what in this house we believe in this.
Right.
And this is something that, if people in social media recognize as virtue signaling, right? I just want you to know I believe in these things. I believe in these things. And
Yes.
I see these banners and signs saying, I support this cause and I'm for this. Okay. Um, and I said, fine, if you're for that cause, if that's your perspective, okay. Why do you need to tell me you are? Why do you need me to know that you're on the right side of that issue? And I think, and I understand why you need to know because we're all looking for a validating performance record that opens the door. We're all trying to develop our own righteousness. It's like we're all endlessly self-justifying, right? I can't go through life just saying, well, I believe these things. Everyone thinks I'm crazy. And I would say, no, 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 I believe the right. I need that person wants me to hear what they believe to justify their life, right?
Mm.
But I do the same thing. I want to explain myself. I want to uh, validate my life, and even as a believer, even as a believer, developing that
For
performance
sure.
record.
I love
So,
that. And that's why, in chapter three, he goes on and he says, there's no one righteous, not even one.
well, that's right. So then he gets to that next section after this, starting in verse 9. And I love this, by the way. He starts off, what then? Are we better than they? No, not at all. Because the easy thing to do is say, well, okay, I know I need Jesus' blood, but I'm still not as bad as that person. Right.
Right.
So, and Paul's like, the whole notion that we're better than anybody. Right. It just dispels that in Romans 3, verse 9. Are we better than they? No, not at all. And this passage, then you started to read it, starting at verse really 10, 11, and 12. Actually, if you have it open, why don't you read it? Romans 3, 10, 11, and 12. Start with 9. Just read 9, 9, 10, 11, 12.
Okay. What shall we conclude then? Are we any better? Not at all. We have already made the charge that Jews and Gentiles alike are under sin. As it is written, there is no one righteous, not even one. There is no one who understands, no one who seeks God. All have turned away. They have together become worthless. There is no one who does good, not even one.
It's relentless repetition, and it's it seems really deliberate. It's there for a reason. In mine, I count 8 times. It's probably I'm overcounting my version. It's really a 7 because 7 seems to be the number of the Bible for things like this. So I'm probably, but I look at verse 9 when he says, Jews, we've already charged that Jews and Greeks are all under sin. I guess that's the positive. The rest are all negatives. There's 7 negative ones. And starting verse 10, there's none righteous, not even one. None who understands, none who seeks for God. All have turned aside, none who does good. It's like Paul is, I think, saying, you are going to miss this. You are going to miss this. You're going to say, well, surely there are some that are good, right? I'm a little good, right? And this, I'm not sure when to work this into the whole description, Greg, but there's very, we all kind of divide the world into, us and them.
Yeah.
We would define ourselves by who I'm not. I say, well, I may be this next, but I'm not like that, right? We look at try people, good people and bad people. You know, there's responsible people and lazy people. There's, whatever. I think I don't know if I use this example in the talk as and I'm not sure it's even good in the podcast, but I think that if you think about social public policy, it's often driven by people dividing the world into good and bad people. So if you're for unions, you think management and companies are bad, big corporations are bad, they take advantage of labor, and so you're pro-union because big companies are bad, they're always going to take advantage of the worker. And then you can have a different perspective that says, no, unions are in it for they were once served a purpose, but now they're corrupting and all they want is more money and they are tying down industry and they're bad. And so you think, here's a group of you come down inside and say the world is good people and bad people. And
Mm,
but very hard to admit to say the Bible says throw all that out. The gospel says throw that out. Everybody's bad. Everybody's
right,
bad.
right.
Will big corporations take advantage of workers if there aren't restrictions and unionization of the change? Yes, they do. They're bad. We will if the union gets enough power, will it drive the companies. Yes, they will. That if you take the perspective that they're good people and bad people, you try to side with one and benefit one to the expense of the other. But there's none righteous. No one's good. Everybody's bad. That's
Yeah.
one way to do it from a
That's what
public
I love.
policy kind of thing.
That's what I love about Paul's teaching and just the gospel in general is that there's not the us versus them. It's not us and them. It's all of, and this is what Paul is laying the case is like all are sinners.
All are
Like
sinners.
it's
Everybody's sinners.
all
Yeah,
like
yeah, and
we
so
are
yeah, maybe yeah, I'll probably leave that out actually, probably from a public policy perspective because it'll get into some debates and arguments, and someone will say, "Well, but one side is more bad than the other," and they want to argue about it. So it's not spiritually speaking, maybe it's not where a road worth
but
going
it's one of
down.
the things that really drives me crazy about our current culture right now is that it seems like everywhere you go, it's us them, it's us them.
Oh yeah, very much so. It's the polarization of society, right?
Oh man,
Yeah,
it is so it is just so crazy.
yeah,
When they and there's a pressure to force you to choose a side,
right. Right.
you
But
know?
think of this just in the Christian perspective. You say, okay, forget the politics and sociological issues and policy issues and all that. Just spiritually, are we better than those other people? We who are, are more religious or more moral and if trying to keep our nose clean and trying to get things, Paul's like saying, we're no better. We're
Right.
no better. I mean, he's trying to say, like, dispel that notion. And this is why this relentless, no, not one, not even one, nobody. He's really trying to drive that home. And then
And
right after that,
I think that actually if we really understood that message and absorbed it, we would be more attractive witnesses for God because
oh, yeah.
part of the big problem when we share our faith is we come across self-righteous.
That's right. And people are looking at that. They're sensitive to that. They think if you're religious, you just think I know what you're
You're
thinking.
better than
You think you're better than me. That's right. And you're trying to get me to be a better person. I don't want to hear it. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Gospel Addict Podcast. Feel free to contact us via email at gospeladdictpodcast@gmail.com.
Stay tuned for our next episode and remember, on your worst days, you're never beyond the reach of God's grace, and on your best days, you're never beyond the need of God's grace.
See you next time.